I remember the day we arrived at the mansion, that brooding relic of a house that loomed at the edge of town like a shadow out of place. The air was thick with the scent of damp wood and age-old secrets, and as we crossed the threshold, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, not by eyes, but by something older, more patient. The house was vast, the kind of place where whispers linger in corners and footsteps echo for miles. Dusty chandeliers hung from the ceilings like forgotten jewels, casting strange, flickering shadows on the walls. But it was the clocks that caught my eye first, dozens of them in every room on every wall. Tall grandfather clocks with ornate carvings, delicate mantel clocks with intricate designs, and even tiny, tarnished pocket watches resting in glass cases. Yet something was off. None of the clocks had hands. Not one. Their faces were blank, smooth as if time had been erased from them entirely. I found myself staring at them, drawn in by the silent tick that seemed to hum in the back of my mind. A tick without a tock, a rhythm without a pulse. My family moved through the house with a mix of excitement and trepidation. We should have been more cautious. My mother murmured something about the beauty of the place, but her voice was distant, like it was coming from somewhere far away. My father, ever practical man, tried to dismiss the strangeness of the clocks, but I could see it in his eyes. He felt it too. As the sun began to set, casting the last of its light through the cracked windows, I couldn't help but feel we had stepped into a place where the rules were different, where time wasn't just measured. It was manipulated, twisted, and as night fell, the mansion seemed to sigh, settling into its old bones as if welcoming us into its grasp.
The first night in the mansion was restless. The air was thick, almost oppressive, and the silence felt unnatural, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint creaks of the old wood settling, or perhaps something else moving within the walls. It was subtle at first, the way time seemed to slip away. The morning light crept through the windows, but it felt wrong, like it was diluted, too pale, too weak. I glanced at my watch and saw that only a few hours had passed since dawn, yet it felt as though half the day had slipped by unnoticed. My parents didn't seem to notice at first, chalking it up to exhaustion from the move. But I knew something was wrong. Days merged into nights with a disconcerting fluidity. Sometimes, I'd catch myself staring out the window, watching the sun sink beneath the horizon, only to blink and find it high in the sky again, as though time had reversed itself. The clocks still hung on the walls, their blank faces haunting every room, the silent tick growing louder in my head. I couldn't understand it. How could clocks with no hands seem to be counting down to something? Conversations with my family became strange, fragmented. My mother would start a sentence, then pause as if she'd forgotten what she was going to say, staring off into the distance like she was lost in a dream. My father grew quiet, spending more time wandering the house, his expression troubled. There were moments when I felt like we were the only ones moving forward, while everything else had slowed down or stopped altogether. One evening, as I walked through the dim hallways, I noticed something else. The shadows had changed. They moved differently, stretching and shifting even when the light stayed still. It was as if they were alive, crawling across the walls like fingers, reaching for something just out of sight. The house was changing, warping around us in ways that defied reason. And in the background, always, that silent ticking, growing louder, more insistent, as if counting down to an event we couldn't comprehend. Time had become a twisted thing in that house. No longer a steady flow, but a series of disjointed moments, all tangled up like the cobwebs that hung in every corner. And we were caught in its snare, unable to escape, unable to understand what was happening to us. We were being pulled deeper into the mansion's grasp, one disorienting hour at a time. The days blurred together, a relentless march of confusion and unease. It was on one of those days, or perhaps it was a night, that I stumbled upon the library, hidden away behind a door I swore had never been there before. The room was suffocatingly still, filled with the musty scent of decaying paper and old leather, the air thick with the weight of forgotten knowledge. Books lined the shelves from floor to ceiling, their spines cracked and titles faded. Most were unreadable, but a few stood out, their bindings strangely pristine, as though they had been waiting for someone to discover them. One in particular caught my eye, an old leather-bound journal, its cover embossed with a delicate clock, hands missing, just like the ones on the walls. I opened it with trembling hands. The pages yellowed and brittle, yet the ink was as fresh as if it had been written yesterday. The entries were disturbing, a fragmented account of a man who had once lived in this very house, long before it had become ours. His words spoke of the same strangeness we were now experiencing, how time had begun to lose its meaning, how the house itself seemed to breathe, to shift, to swallow him whole. He wrote of the clocks, of how they were more than just mechanisms to measure time. They were guardians, he said, keepers of something far darker. The hands had been removed, not because they were broken, but because they were dangerous. He had tried to leave, but the house wouldn't let him. It twisted time around him, trapping him in moments that never passed, reliving the same horrors over and over again. As I read, I began to piece together the history of the mansion. It had belonged to a wealthy family, prosperous and respected, until tragedy struck. The patriarch had been an obsessive man, consumed by his experiments with time, convinced he could control it, bend it to his will. But something went wrong, terribly wrong. The house had become a prison, not just for him, but for everyone who set foot inside. The clocks were his curse, a constant reminder of his failure, a way to ensure that time would never move forward, that the past would never be forgotten. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized we were reliving their fate, caught in the same web of twisted time. My family was becoming part of the house's history, just as the man in the journal had warned. The clocks were not merely broken relics. They were waiting, biding their time until they could claim us too. The visions began not long after I uncovered the mansion's dark history. They started as fleeting glimpses, shadows that didn't belong, faces in the corners of mirrors, gone before I could turn to see them fully. But soon, they grew more vivid, more terrifying. The house was peeling back its layers, revealing the horrors buried within its walls. One night, I woke to the sound of faint weeping echoing through the hallways. It was soft at first, barely audible, but it grew louder, more desperate, until it was all I could hear. I followed the sound, my heart pounding in my chest, down the twisting corridors until I reached the parlor. The room was bathed in a cold, pale light, and there, standing by the fireplace, was a woman. She was dressed in clothes from another era, her face obscured by a veil, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. I wanted to speak, to ask who she was, but the words caught in my throat. As I stepped closer, the air grew heavy, thick with sorrow and despair. She turned to face me, and as she did, the room changed. Suddenly, I was no longer in the parlor. I was standing in the same room, but it was different, furnished as it might have been decades ago. The walls were lined with portraits of stern-faced men and women, their eyes cold and unforgiving. The woman was still there, but now she was not alone. A man stood beside her, his face twisted in anger, his hands clenched into fists. I could feel the tension in the air, the weight of unspoken words, of a fight that had been brewing for years. I watched in horror as the scene played out before me. The man's rage boiled over, his voice rising in fury, and the woman's sobs grew louder, more frantic. He grabbed her by the arm, dragging her toward the fireplace, where the flames roared higher, unnaturally bright. She struggled, but he was too strong, and with a final, anguished cry, he pushed her into the fire. The flames engulfed her, and her screams echoed in my ears, piercing and endless. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it was over. I was back in the parlor, the room dark and silent, the woman gone. But the scent of burning flesh lingered in the air, and I could still hear the faint echo of her screams. From that night on, the visions came more frequently, each one more disturbing than the last. My family was not immune. My father began to see things, too. Faces in the windows, figures standing at the foot of his bed. My mother became withdrawn, her eyes hollow, as if she had seen something too terrible to speak of. We were being haunted, not just by ghosts, but by the house's memories, by the events that had played out within its walls. It was as if the house was trying to pull us into its past, to make us relive the tragedies that had occurred there, over and over again. And with each vision, each haunting glimpse into the mansion's history, I felt my grip on reality slipping further. Time was unraveling around us, and I feared that soon, we would be lost to it entirely. The mansion was unraveling us, thread by thread. By the time I uncovered the truth, it was almost too late. I had grown obsessed with the clocks, the way they ticked without hands, the way their silent rhythm filled every corner of the house. The visions had left me shaken, but it was the discovery in the basement that finally broke me. It was a room I had never seen before, hidden behind a heavy, iron door at the bottom of a narrow staircase. The air was colder there, thick with a stale, metallic scent that clung to my throat. I pushed the door open, and the first thing I noticed was the sound, a low, mechanical hum that seemed to vibrate through my bones. The room was filled with clocks, hundreds of them, all different shapes and sizes, lining the walls, covering the tables, hanging from the ceiling. But these were different from the ones in the rest of the house. These clocks had hands, but they didn't move. They were frozen in time, each one set to a different hour, a different minute, as if capturing a moment that had been trapped forever. In the center of the room was a large, ancient clock, its face cracked and worn, the glass fogged with age. It stood on a pedestal, towering over the others, its hands slowly moving backward. I could barely breathe as I approached it, feeling the pull of something dark and powerful, something that had been lying in wait for years. There was an inscription at the base of the clock, carved deep into the stone. Time is a circle. What has been will be again. I understood then, with a sickening clarity, that the house was not just haunted by memories. It was a prison, a trap for those who had crossed the threshold. The clocks were not broken. They were the guardians of a cycle, one that repeated endlessly, trapping the souls of those who had lived and died within these walls. The hands had been removed to stop time from moving forward, to keep us all in this endless loop of suffering. The visions we had been seeing were not just echoes of the past. They were warnings, glimpses into a fate we were destined to share. The family who had lived here before us had fallen into the same trap, their lives unraveling until they were consumed by the house's curse. And now, we were next. My family was becoming part of the mansion's twisted history, another chapter in its endless story. I knew then that we had to escape, but how could we? Time itself was our enemy. The clocks, those silent sentinels, were counting down to something, waiting for the moment when the cycle would begin again. And as I stood there, staring at that ancient clock, I realized with a jolt of terror that the hands were beginning to move forward once more. We were out of time. The house was waking up, ready to claim us, to trap us in its dark embrace forever. And there was nothing we could do to stop it. The house had come alive. As the hands on the ancient clock in the basement began to inch forward, the mansion shuddered, as if roused from a long, malevolent slumber. The walls groaned, the floors creaked, and the air grew thick with a palpable sense of dread. We had to leave now, but as we raced through the halls, the house seemed to twist and stretch around us, warping space itself. Doors led to the wrong rooms, corridors looped back on themselves, and every turn brought us deeper into its labyrinth. My parents were frantic, their faces pale with terror, their eyes wild as they tried to find a way out. My father kicked at a door that refused to open, splintering the wood, while my mother clutched my arm, her grip so tight it hurt. The ticking was everywhere now, a relentless, deafening beat that pounded in my skull. The clocks were no longer silent. They had awoken, their hands moving faster and faster, spinning out of control, as if counting down to our doom. We burst into the foyer, the front door in sight, and for a fleeting moment, hope surged within me. But as we reached it, the door slammed shut with a force that rattled the walls. My father yanked at the handle, but it was no use. We were trapped. The windows were next, but the glass wouldn't break, no matter how hard we pounded on it. We were rats in a maze, and the walls were closing in. Then, the lights flickered, and the shadows around us deepened, stretching into impossible shapes. The house was no longer content to simply trap us. It was toying with us, dragging us deeper into its nightmare. The walls pulsed, alive with a dark energy, and the air grew colder, so cold I could see my breath misting in the air. Suddenly, the foyer wasn't the foyer anymore. We were standing in the parlor, the one where I'd first seen the woman in the veil. But this time, the room was filled with people. Ghostly figures dressed in clothes from different eras, their faces pale and empty, their eyes hollow. They stood in a circle around us, watching silently, as if they had been waiting for us all along. Among them, I saw the man from the journal, his face twisted in agony, his eyes pleading for release. He stepped forward, reaching out to me, but before he could speak, the clock struck midnight. The sound was a violent explosion of noise, reverberating through the house, shaking the very foundations. And then, everything went still. The ghosts vanished, the house grew silent, and the air was thick with anticipation. It was as if the mansion was holding its breath, waiting for something. The silence stretched on, oppressive and unyielding, until I could barely stand it. My mother's hand slipped from my arm, her face a mask of resignation. My father sank to his knees, his eyes hollow, as if the fight had gone out of him. I realized, with a cold, sinking dread, that we weren't going to escape. We were never meant to escape. The house had claimed us, just as it had claimed those before us. We were part of it now, another thread woven into its tapestry of horror. In the distance, I heard the ticking start again, slow and steady, the hands of the clocks resuming their relentless march. The mansion had reset, the cycle beginning anew. And as I stood there, paralyzed by the weight of my fate, I knew that someday, another family would cross the threshold of this cursed house, and they too would find themselves caught in its web. We had become the ghosts, the lost souls trapped within the walls, waiting for the next inhabitants to take our place. The house would continue to play its cruel game, bending time, twisting reality, until it had consumed us all. And so, the clocks ticked on, as they always had, as they always would, counting down to the moment when the cycle would begin again.